Okay, Chapter 2 of the People's History of the United States, entitled Drawing the Color Line. Zinn makes several interesting points. There's overarching threads that kind of run through the chapter as it depicts the slavery of the Africans in the Americas. He mentions that the European and African cultures of the time, through the 1400s, really were fairly equal and in some ways rivals, but that really the only advantage the Europeans had was they had more advanced weaponry. In terms of the organization, their agriculture techniques, and even their architecture, that in most of those ways and their societal constructs, even though they were different, they were in many ways on equal footing in terms of advancement. But he says too that even with the advanced weaponry, which was they had guns rather than arrows and swords, and they also had ships, which was an advantage because they could bring themselves to the coast more readily. But even with that, they couldn't secure inland territories, that they were basically forced to set up forts and small footholds along the coast, and then they had to develop diplomatic relations with the African leadership. Now he says there was slavery within the African culture, which, first off, he notes that it was sort of a more mild form. It was more of a serfdom or indentured servitude, where the slaves of Africa were given some rights. They were allowed to marry and maybe own land, and that over a period of time, as many as 80% or more were sort of amalgamated into the family, at least, if not this, or they were amalgamated into the society, if not into their own family of the ownership, and which was sort of made easier because they shared a similar culture and traditions and race and all that. Where obviously in the Americas they fed on basically the separate natures of the cultures. But anyway, he says that the hierarchical structure was very similar, which of course brings in the corruption and the other things, the profit motive and the power grabbing, and that basically allowed for the slave trade. That in a lot of ways, while the whites certainly took advantage of the situation, in a lot of ways, the African power, whatever you want to call them, the elites of the time, really, and the tribal leadership would take this subjugated class that they had and sell them off or barter them into slavery with the Europeans. The journey of the slave, he details this at some length, and it's really abhorrent, to say the least, that the overland, the death march, where they would be shackled and at gunpoint and all tied together, and it could be hundreds or even over 1,000 miles to the coast, where the slave trade companies would segregate them, cage them, inspect them, brand them, and they'd await shipment at these places to be shipped to the Americas. This could take weeks and weeks, and in some cases, I'd imagine even months, for the overland journey itself, and then more weeks where they were caged up waiting their shipment. It said in this overland part, as many as 40% of the people that were captured died in that transit alone. And then once the ships came, which was in a lot of ways worse than the overland, they were crammed together. They were basically layered between the decks to be shipped in areas 18 to 24 inches high and shoulder to shoulder. Basically, it was almost like a coffin. They bored them up between the decks and just allowed to lay like that in their own muck. for almost the entire trip, with minimum amounts of food and water. They were really unable to roll over, and they said another 30 to 35% died during this part of the journey. They say as many as 50 million Africans died by 1800, basically in what was almost 400 years of slave trading, 350 anyway. 50 million Africans died, which is just, I mean, it's unbelievable. He talks about the once they got to the Americas, that of course there was white slavery. That's kind of how it started out in the colonies, but the settlers quickly realized that the number of white slaves brought from Europe, simply there wasn't enough of them. That most of the white slaves were either prisoners or debtors, and they were forced into servitude in those means, but there simply wasn't enough coming from Europe. So first they turned to the Indians after that, and they ran into problems as well, because the Indians, first of all, they outnumbered the settlers, so it was tough for them to subjugate them. But also, it was Indians' home turf, more or less, so they really, it gave the Indians an advantage there. And also, they were nearby their own cultures, and they were fiercely independent. So even if they captured certain Indians, they would oftentimes escape or be rescued. And of course, we went over in chapter 1 a lot of the border skirmishes and the violence that occurred. But basically, it's because the white settlers, the Europeans, figured it was easier just to attack and basically push the Indians out rather than try to subjugate them completely. It was becoming too inefficient. So when they got the African slave trade going, they found that the blacks, once they got to the Americas, were in a lot of ways easier to subjugate, simply because once they were torn out of their culture and their communal sort of environment, they were separated very early on from any family. They'd be, basically alone, and were, basically they were broken. Their spirits were broken, and they became much more easily subjugated. Let's see that. Of course, profit motive is at the root of most of this. He does talk about other conditions that precipitate slavery, where, again, like I mentioned at the beginning, it's sort of maybe looked at as a natural evolution of a superior culture just taking an inferior or less advanced culture and just sort of steamrolling it. But in a lot of ways, that's a broad oversimplification, where, of course, there's natural suspicion and fear, and in some ways distaste of different groups, whether they're races, whether they're different country members, even if they look the same, different languages. A lot of things can bring that about, but that really, that it's a big jump to go from that and maybe some infighting amongst the peoples to just utter subordination. And that's where the profit motive comes in, where the plantation system and the capitalistic agriculture, which developed in the colonies, really demanded an endless supply of labor for this newfound source of wealth that was traded and shipped back to Europe and beyond. And he also notes, the color-based that it was easier to segregate based on race because of those natural distastes. Basically, they cultured or cultivated, I guess I should say, some of the natural wariness and they did this in a lot of ways, and some of it was they found that the white slaves and the black slaves and even the Indian slaves would consider each other more or less equals, and because it was a slave class, and they became afraid of this because of the growing numbers of slaves. So basically, they went to the tried and true divide and conquer. So they started offering privilege and certain benefits, mostly along racial lines, in order to keep the slave class, sort of wary of each other and fighting amongst themselves, rather than trying to come together in some type of revolution. And he notes that there was not much organized resistance, and that's as evidenced as the slave, sort of culture in the Americas went on for 200 years or more, and that there was organized resistance in terms of slowdowns and sabotage on the plantations themselves, but most of it was unorganized, where a group of people, a small number of people, or even an individual would run away, or maybe try to kill their master, or kill some of the whites in the area and the different overseers and supervisors, which is natural, because freedom is a strong motivation, no matter how many generations of subjugation is brought in. But over time, when the slave numbers grew, it became more and more ruthless, as the fear amongst the oligarchy grew, and they would bring in the laws to back up basically the power structure, because once they had the wealth and the power sort of centralized, obviously it became paramount to maintain that structure. So, like I said, they gave more privileges to some, and even not only amongst race, but most commonly amongst race. Like I said, the laws would come in that made it illegal for blacks and whites or Indians to really come together in any way, whether it be man and woman, or whether it be just by groups or meetings. I mean, it was at one point illegal for more than two people of color to be in a group together, and the punishments were way over the top. I mean, there would be public torture, cutting off of limbs, hanging, burning, any measure of death, and all this was done in public to thwart, others and keep them from getting the idea of insurrection. Of course, any type of slavery is it's an ugly, ugly thing, but it's all propelled by fear and power and wealth, and he goes into this at fairly detailed measure. On a side note, I think it's kind of ironic in a way that even today the same method is used, and I think I used the term tried and true before. Even if you think of something simple as a credit card, where you have your factory worker just has a regular old MasterCard, and then you have your white collar guy has a platinum card, and with airline rewards or whatever, but it's different little privilege doled out to some over the others. But what we all fail to realize is we're subjugated under the same debt system, and that's just one example. And obviously, it's not nearly as boot in the face or as horrific as object slavery. I don't mean to insinuate that, but I just think that it shouldn't be overlooked that this method of control is used, whether overtly or subvertly. It's been maintained. So, at any rate, that's chapter 2, and we'll move on to chapter 3.